I'm still researching the Civil War in America, which was from 1861 to 1865, and how it was used by the members of the aristocracy, including the planter aristocracy, to profit in the post-war environment. I'm focusing on the Atlanta area, since it's the location of the famous fire that burned the city down during the Civil War in 1864. It seems from my research, after that fire, the elites used that opportunity to develop real estate. This burning of things to rebuild seems to be a reoccurring theme with these elites, as we have seen recently with Hawaii, California, and North Carolina. I also suspect that the burning of Atlanta was planned because they wrote literature and made a movie about it. Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind.
Take a good look, my dear. It's a historic moment. You can tell your grandchildren how you watched the old South disappear one night.
It's a historic moment. You can tell your grandchildren how you watched the old South disappear one night. You know it's real because it looks so fake. I have another example of an aristocratic family from the Atlanta area, the Inmans, that fits our pattern. But first I want to review who the planter aristocracy was, which I've covered before in other videos, but I didn't realize they were assigned an actual class called the planter class. The planter class were a European caste used to colonize America and form the American gentry. George Washington, the Freemason, was a member of this planter class. They owned plantations, producing cash crops of tobacco, cotton, coffee, indigo, hemp, fruit, sugarcane, etc., using forced labor of enslaved people. Initially, these plantations were operated with the labor of indentured servants from Europe, but they were eventually supplanted by enslaved Africans brought to the Americas via the Atlantic slave trade. Colonial plantations formed the triangular trade, where European goods were brought to Africa and exchanged for slaves, and those slaves were brought to the Americas and sold to colonists, who used them to produce cash crops which were shipped back to Europe. Most African slaves brought to the Americas were sold to the planter class, who frequently subjected them to brutal mistreatment. One of the last ports of the Atlantic slave trade was Jekyll Island in Georgia. The Wanderer was a slave ship that docked at Jekyll Island in 1858 with over 400 African slaves, and that was one of the last known shipments of slaves to America after the Atlantic slave trade had been abolished and outlawed. Beginning in the mid-18th century, abolitionism arose in Europe and the Americas. So if it was already outlawed by 1858, then what was the Civil War really about? Because that began in 1861. I think it was a way for these aristocrats, the American gentry, to make sure they could still profit and control after slavery was abolished. In prior videos, I've given a lot of examples of those people, and they are in my playlist titled Witches Who Settled and Governed America. One of the ways these people did this was to burn down Atlanta and apparently Chicago and maybe other cities to make way for real estate and other ways that they could profit and control the citizenship. They love to burn stuff down when they have other plans for it, as we have seen in Hawaii, California, and North Carolina recently. The abolition of slavery led to a rapid decline in the fortunes of the planter class, but they still profited from the Civil War and afterwards. In my last video, I did about the other aristocratic family that fits this pattern, the Cranes, a commenter said this: Crane High School in Chicago is named after Richard T. Crane, Jr. An alumnus of Crane High School in Chicago was Martin Cooper, who invented the handheld cell phone. Richard T. Crane's company made big money during the Civil War and after the Chicago fire. His factory survived, along with all industry and railroads. Everyone in the club had their financial interests untouched. Only commercial and people's homes burned. The waterworks for the city was one of the first things to burn during the Chicago fire, which basically screwed everyone except the club, who lived on the North Shore away from the peasants. The old myth was that the fire started when a cow knocked over a lantern in a barn, Miss O'Leary's cow. The fire started on Sunday night at 9 p.m. Who milks a cow at 9 p.m. on Sunday? The etymology of Catherine O'Leary is Catherine equals innocent, O'Leary equals keeper of the calves. So that commenter is insinuating that it was fake news and that the name etymology is a nod to that. Now we'll go over the other example of the planter American gentry class family, the Inmans, who also profited from the Civil War in a post-war urban environment. They were also members of this planter class, which evolved into the South's political and economic leaders, roles which were not new to them after the Civil War. This is their family crest. You can see the dragon at the top and the Rosicrucian flowers with pentagram overlaid. I went as far back as Abednego Inman, who was from Yorkshire, England, and he migrated to the U.S. and fought in the Revolutionary War. So they fit this pattern that I've been talking about all the way. His grandson was named Shadrach, who is the father of Samuel Inman. Samuel Inman was born in 1843, and he was a cotton merchant. He was part owner in the Atlanta Journal, which is a newspaper. He's best known for the Atlanta neighborhood that bears his name, Inman Park. And this area, Inman Park, was part of the battlefield in the Battle of Atlanta in 1864, which was burned. See how that works? After this burning Inman Park, the neighborhood was conceived of and promoted as a segregated community, though. There were a bunch of mansions there. Samuel Inman fits our pattern of these aristocrats who were officers in the Civil War because he was a lieutenant on the Confederate side in the Civil War. He attended Princeton but was only awarded his diploma after the close of the Civil War for his part, you see. These Inmans all had biblical names: Samuel, Shadrach, Abednego, Ezekiel, Lazarus, and Elisha. His family has connections to Irish notables. Robert Inman is 18 degrees from C.S. Lewis, 24 degrees from Pierce Brosnan, 16 degrees from George Bernard Shaw, and 23 degrees from William Yeats. The Inmans came to Atlanta from Tennessee around the time of the Civil War, acting as agents for the Northwestern Bank of Georgia. They purchased cotton from farmers and then resold it when the market turned more favorable. With that money, they expanded to railroads. To influence shipping rates, they obtained positions on various boards of railroads as stockholders, and as a result, became president of Richmond and Danville Railroad in 1890. They invested very profitably in Atlanta real estate, streetcar lines, banking, and insurance, and eventually became involved in Atlanta politics and, quote, charitable organizations. So the real estate investments were with their friend Joel Hurt, their real estate and streetcar investments. So they were friends with this Joel Hurt. And Hurt is the one who founded Druid Hills, aka Witch Hills in Atlanta also. And Hurt was also one of the founders of SunTrust Bank. Most of this development in Atlanta took place shortly after the Civil War ended in 1865 when Atlanta was burned, so figure that one out. Hurt owned convict labor camps where many of his workers died of abuse. Samuel's brother, John H. Inman, was head of the investment company Inman, Swan and Co. of New York and president of Richmond and West Point Terminal Railway and Warehouse Company, a holding company which controlled several railroads that served Atlanta throughout the Southeast. Hugh T. Inman owned the Kimball House Hotel in Atlanta, and other relatives were involved in the family business. The Swan House in Atlanta is a mansion that was built for the Inmans. In Greek mythology, the swan was a bird consecrated to Apollo, and they are represented in ancient Greek and Egyptian art, and they are all over this mansion. And this mansion was had been featured in the Hunger Games Catching Fire and Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2. Stone obelisks and fountains are present outside the house. There are broken pediments of Roman Doric columns inspired by Duncombe Park in Yorkshire, England. Black and white checkered board floor, and this is a pentagram in sacred geometry in the middle of that in the foyer. The Inmans also owned an orphanage. Arthur Inman was the grandson of Samuel Inman. He was a reclusive poet who wrote a 17 million word diary, one of the longest English diaries on record, in which he recorded his prejudice against non-Nordic people. His diaries have been adopted into plays, operas, and films. This guy seemed to have been possessed. He committed suicide, and it looks like he has elf ears. Thanks for listening.